Hi, welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. This is Stephanie Brennan. Today we have a brand new quilt tutorial for you. This is actually using Stephanie's original line, Nocturne, made from QT fabrics. The quilt is called Cosmos, and this has actually been in the makings for a little while because I had the start of a quilt pattern in my head for quite a while, and then once I actually kind of got it on paper, showed it to Stephanie, she really liked it, so here we are. Now we are presenting it to you. So this quilt, instead of just having one block repeated in the quilt, actually has 3 blocks. So it's going to look a little bit more challenging, but it's a lot of just basic techniques that if you've been following Quilt Addicts Anonymous for any length of time, these are all going to be very, very familiar to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do each block one at a time, just like how the pattern is written, and show you how to put everything together. So let's get started. So as you can see here with block A, a lot of it really is placement. You know, we've got just squares, we have some rectangles here, and we have half square triangles, and we're making a star just by putting them all together and arranging them a certain way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to make the 2 half square triangles that go here, and then I'll show you how I put the whole thing together. So the first step for making 2 at a time half square triangles is we are drawing a line from corner to corner on the lighter of the 2 squares. There's all sorts of marking tools that you can use. We really like these friction gel pins because you can draw them on here, and then as soon as you press it with the iron, it goes away with heat. So I like to kind of start here in the middle because we are working with a bias, and just make your line. Now I'm really exaggerating mine because I want you to be able to see it. All that you really need as far as darkness is to just make it as dark as you can see it. So you have your line, from corner to corner, and what we're going to do is we're going to put our 2 squares, the larger of the squares in this block, right sides together. And then with the sewing machine, we're going to sew 1/4 inch on each side of this line. If you want to pin, you certainly can, especially if you're a beginner, it's probably a good idea to pin it. So when we're pinning it, you really want to pin here at the top and here at the bottom, because this is where you're actually sewing. So this is where we want to make sure the fabric doesn't shift at all. If you pin it over here, which I know a lot of folks like to do, your fabric can still shift in the middle. So we want to keep it nice and straight, nice and accurate. So if you want to pin it up here. I like to start with what will be my half square triangle, just a teensy tiny bit under the foot, like right where the needle would go down in the fabric. Just because that might be an old habit. I know some machines don't like the needle to go down where there's no fabric there. They can get pretty finicky. So I put it down just short of that, and then I line the edge of my presser foot up with that line. So that way I know that I'm going to have my 1/4 inch stitch, or 1/4 inch seam allowance rather. You could do a scant 1/4 inch seam on here, which actually that's probably a better idea, to do a scant 1/4 inch seam, which just means that it is just like it's a needle width shy of a full 1/4 inch. And just hold your finger here on the corner. Take that pin out if you have a pin. Do not let your pins go under your needle. That'll be a big mistake. And then once you can't keep a hold of it with your finger, just reach over here on the side, keep it going straight. Now, since there are 8 half square triangles in this block, this is a really good time to just chain piece it. So once you have all of your half square triangles marked, just line them up and do all of this first stitch all itself, and then turn them all around and sew down the other side as well. Now from here, what we're going to do is we're going to cut right on this line, and then once we open up the 2 halves, we're going to have 2 half square triangles. So here is our 2 half square triangles. Now from here, we're going to press them open, and then we're going to trim. All right, so I do usually press my seams open now, although I have pressed them to one side or the other in the past. With this quilt, especially because there's going to be a lot of corners that we're going to want to match up and make sure that they stay nice and pointy, it is a lot easier to go ahead and press it open. All right, so the pattern is going to tell you exactly what size to trim these squares to. If you have a smaller, like 6-inch square ruler, that's going to make this a lot easier. But basically you want to make sure that this line is making a 45-degree angle. So it's following the corners of your ruler. And then just trim it off. Now the way the pattern is written, you have a little bit of wiggle room on these half square triangles in case you make a mistake or in case your seam allowance isn't perfect. But as you can see here, there's not a whole lot I'm trimming off. So really make sure that you are taking your time and making the step accurate. And as you can see, we didn't trim off a whole lot, but it makes a big difference in your quilt. And now we are ready to sew block A together. Now what I like to do is for whatever size you're making, I like to make all of my block A's and then all of my block B's and all of my block C's. So what I would do, I only have one right now, but I would stack each piece all together like this. And then once they're all together, I would sew them all at once. Now you can do what works for you. I tend to like the assembly line process. Now, when I was making this quilt, I found it easiest to kind of do each quadrant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these 4 together, then these 4, these 4, these 4, and then put everything together like a 9 patch. All right, because I'm chain piecing, I'm going to go ahead and sew the next 4, then I'll press them all at once. So what I just did was I cut each quadrant apart, but I'm keeping the individual squares in that quadrant together. That just helps me remember which one goes where. All right, and now we are going to press open all of those seams. This is also a really good chance for you to check and make sure that everything is going the same direction so far, because what you're looking for is for the half square triangle lines to be parallel with each other. All right, so far so good. So let's sew these quadrants together. So here what you want to do is make sure your center seam is together. If it's helpful to stick a pin in there. I know I like to put a pin on each side of the seam allowance, just because that way as it's going under your sewing machine, one of the sides of the seam allowance won't tuck under. And we're going to chain piece again, just like we did the first time around. All right, now we're going to press these seams open and then put everything together. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I like to do things in kind of an assembly line format. So I will do, when working on each block, I will do everything that I can before I need to do the next step. So in this case, it's pressing. So right here is a good illustration on why pressing seams open tends to work better for things like this, in my opinion, is that with the seams open, you can see exactly where the point of that half square triangle is. So when we're sewing the whole thing together, you can watch for this and make sure you're not cutting off that point. So that way when we're done, we still have them all. All right, now we're going to sew all this together. With the smaller pieces, it's really important to make sure your seam allowances are accurate. So it's very, very easy. It's a small, well, it's a short, straight stitch, but really make sure that 1/4 inch seam allowance is as darn near perfect as you can get it. Now, normally when I'm sewing pieces together, I like to have the smaller piece on top and the larger piece next to the feed dogs. In this case, I'm doing the opposite because I want to be able to see where this half square triangle is and make sure that I get that point. And here I'm laying each piece out back to where they go. And since the seams are not intersecting, I'm going to go ahead and sew this last piece to the first 2, and then we'll press them all at the same time. This time, because there are so many intersecting seams, there's just a lot of seams going on here. Just really, really be careful. I have a habit of just sliding my iron all over the place. You don't want to do that with this. You really want to pick it up more than anything. So that way you don't fold these seam allowances over when you're pressing this. If you do press a seam the wrong way, or if it folds over, and it won't press the way you want it to, you can get a little bit of water from your spray mister. That kind of helps loosen it up, so to speak. And then make sure everything is going the right direction when you go over it again. Now, normally I don't like to use steam until the very end, but sometimes you got to use it a little bit sooner. All right, block A is almost done. Now, again, I am putting the larger piece on top because then I can see exactly where this point is and I can make sure not to cut it off. One more press and block A is done. Now this is probably the trickiest part to press because especially right here, we've got all those seams coming in together, and right here and here. Just take your time, lift and press, don't run it along. At least not beyond this very beginning. Now we're gonna give the whole thing a nice spray with the spray mister and press the whole thing nice and flat. So that is block A, there you go. Now that we are getting ready to do block B, I gathered all of the pieces that I'm gonna need for block B. We're gonna go over how to fussy cut the owl so that it's nice and centered and it looks good on your quilt. We also have 2 sets of 4 at a time flying geese. So I'm gonna walk you through how to do those so that it's nice and efficient, there's no waste, and you always keep your points. So the first step, just like your half square triangles, you're going to take your set of 4 smaller squares and we're going to mark a diagonal line corner to corner on these as well. Now, same technique, line your ruler up corner to corner. I did go and get the 6.5 inch one because these are a lot smaller and there's a lot more of them, and the smaller ruler is a lot easier to use than the big one for this. So again, I'm going to use my friction gel pen. I'm going to start in the middle, pointing the pen towards the center. And again, I'm like really exaggerating this line so that to make sure that you can see it on camera. So that's pretty dark. You don't need to go over it that much when you do it yourself. Just enough so that you can see it, you know where you're supposed to sew. Now, one other thing that I want to mention, you may or may not have noticed that the background and a lot of these pieces are technically a directional print. The way that we're putting this together, that directional print is not always going to go the same direction, which these actually are pretty small. So that does not bother me at all. And also if it does bother you, with the number of blocks that are in this and the number of times the directions are going to go all which way, we'll just call it a design choice. It'll be our little secret. The first step for 4 at a time flying geese is we're going to take our bigger square and 2 of our smaller ones, and we're going to line them up going diagonally. Now there is going to be some overlap. That's good. We want that. And your line should continue unbroken through here. Now I do like to pin these just because there are multiple pieces here. I like to make sure that they stay where they're supposed to be. So just like the half square triangles, you want to pin along the line that you're stitching so that that part of the fabric does not shift around as it goes through your machine. I'm going to put another one here in the middle. All right, and just like before, what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that this line is the edge of the fabric. We're going to line our foot up right next to it, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side. So now I'm going to take both of these and I'm going to cut along this pink line. Now, if you are a little worried because these things look weird at this point, don't worry, they're supposed to look weird. So we're going to, just like before, we're going to press these open and then put the other squares on. So we have our 4 pieces here. Now we're going to put the last square on and sew them up. Now with this, again, you're going to put the square in the corner of the bigger one. You're going to point that line up vertically. So it's going to the bottom of the big square and in between your 2 smaller ones. And I'm going to go ahead and pin it in place just because I have several of these put together. Now when you're sewing these 4 at a time flying geese, there is very, very little wiggle room on here. We're going to trim off a teensy tiny bit once we're done. But the way that the math works out is that it's not really possible to create a lot of wiggle room that we can trim off without distorting the shape of the flying geese. So just really, really be careful. Really take your time with that seam allowance. Make sure that it's a good 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch. That would be fine too, but that's about all the leeway that you're going to have. Now, before we cut these apart, I want to show you this. Another really good way to tell if the seam allowance on your flying geese is correct is to look at where your seam is coming out on the second round. It should be right along in this little valley here. Like this point or this dip here should be a 1/4 inch from the line on both sides. Now, since there is room for a scant 1/4 inch, if it's a little teensy tiny bit off, like a thread width or something, that's probably fine. But you want, if you're coming out at a 1/4 inch on these, you're good. That's what we're looking for. So now, just like we've been doing, we're going to cut along the line. Now I'm also looking here to make sure that my stitch is right on this 1/4 inch mark or just inside it, a thread width inside it. All right, so now that we have our 2 sets of the 4 at a time flying geese cut, it's time to trim them down. Now I already have trimmed a couple down and I'm gonna put these side by side so you can see the difference. We're really not cutting off a whole lot. We're barely just kind of trimming the edges, but you can see with these 2, it really makes a big difference. So I'm gonna show you how to do it so that you're centering this point so you're not gonna be a little off kilter at all. And make sure it stays nice and sharp. The pattern gives you the measurement that you're going to trim the flying geese patches to. So what you want to do first of all is when you're laying your ruler down, which for this one, the smaller ruler is going to make your life a million times easier because you're not going to have all that bulk to deal with. So kind of flatten out your flying geese patch. I think it's flying geese even when it's singular. So that's a little bit wonky. So you're going to find the midpoint and then put this point at that center point when you're measuring. Now what I like to do, because I have cut some points off a little too close, like so that it's getting into this 1/4 inch seam allowance, is for this first cut, we're really focusing more on the width of the patch and not so much the height of it. We can fix the height later on with the second cut. Because in my opinion, if you're gonna have to cut some off, it's better to do it here on the bottom where we're not gonna risk losing that point, especially when we're cutting off this small amount. So line it up, make sure that you have a little bit of overlap and just slice. And as you can see, it's really not a whole lot. This is why those seam allowances when we're first making these are so important, because there's not a whole lot of wiggle room. And there is your trimmed flying geese block. Now, depending on the size of the quilt that you're making, you might have just a couple more to do, or you might have a lot more to do. Something else to note when you're doing your second cut is if your ruler has a 45-degree line on it, which most do, you can line that up with one of the sides of your flying geese. That feels so weird to say when I'm talking about just one, but I'm pretty sure that that's the correct term in quilting jargon. I will say this too, having a sharp rotary cutter makes a huge difference, because when I was doing this at home, I am just now realizing how dull my rotary cutter was, because I was like having to muscle that rotary cutter through to trim all these flying geese down, and it was making my shoulder pretty sore. So if you're having to muscle it through, or if when you're cutting and right here at the corner it starts to slide, it's time to change your blade, which is going to happen a lot more often than you probably think it does. But change your blade it makes a big difference. So we could go on and sew all of the flying geese pieces together and get ready to make our block, but I'm going to actually show you how you can fussy cut the owl so that it's centered and it looks nice. And then we can do all of our sewing at once. So the size that you're cutting it to is in the pattern. So what I like to do is kind of find a landmark, so to speak, on the piece. Just kind of pick something that's going to be your center. And if you have some painter's tape, that's going to be really easy to paint, to put on here so that you can see everything all at once. And it's a lot easier for me to just turn the mat at this point than it is to turn everything else. Here's a perfectly centered fussy cut owl. All right, so here is the layout of block B. So what we're going to do first is we're going to sew each of these flying geese together in sets of 2, and then we're going to sew the whole thing together as a 9 patch. So when you're putting your flying geese blocks together, I like to put the one with the point on top, and I'm going to watch this point as I slide it under the presser foot. If you need to fudge it a little bit to make sure you get that point, go ahead and do so. And now you guessed it, we're going to press them open and then sew it all together. Now, like I said earlier, I'm really not worrying about the directional print on here. It's a very, very small directional print. So just don't even worry about it and then call it a design choice later. So something else that Stephanie has done a lot that I've learned and picked up is the 2 pinning method. And we're going to use this when we have 2 points that come together, like right here in the corner. So what we're going to do is line it up, and we're going to put a pin right at the point and just leave it there. Turn it over and make sure, so it's actually a little bit off, so I'm going to adjust it just a tiny bit. All right, so now the 2 points are exactly where they need to be. So I'm not going to move the pin. I'm just going to pinch this. I'm going to put a second pin in place. So this first pin is going to hold the 2 points together. The second pin holds everything else together. All right. So make sure that you do not sew over your pin, but I like to wait until the last possible second to take it out. One final press and this block is done. You have a lot of seams in close proximity here. So just take your time, be careful. When you get to this part, just make sure that you hold the seams open and then pick up your iron and lift it rather than slide it. I'm going to give this a spray and another press, and then we're ready to go on to block C. And we have block B. Our final block for block C is a modified churn dash, and it's going to be a square and a square in the middle. And then we're going to strip piece the sides of the churn dash, and then the corner is going to be half square triangles. Now we've already gone over how to do 2 at a time half square triangles in part A, so I won't go through that again. And instead, we're going to start with how to do the square and a square. Now, just like we have done a couple times already, we are going to draw lines from corner to corner on the back of the smaller of the 2 squares. Now your pattern will give you the measurements. Now you can see I already have lines drawn on here with a different friction pen, so I'm just going to go over it again. Just like we've been doing, make sure you're pointing your friction pen towards the middle. And then one of my biggest pet peeves is when patterns have a lot of waste. So whenever I can, I try to avoid that. So this would otherwise be waste on here. So what I did was I moved the ruler over a 1/2 inch and drew another line. And what I'm going to do is when we're going to go through an assembly line, sew these again, We're going to sew on both of these lines, and then we're going to cut down the middle. So we're going to have what we need for the square and a square block, and some bonus half square triangles that we can use somewhere on this project or on another project later on. Now, just like we did in the 4-at-a-time flying geese in the last block, with this one, we are going to put the smaller corners in the diagonal corners of the larger square. But the difference is, instead of the lines going towards each other and making one continuous line, this time they're going to be parallel to each other. Now, if you decide to do that bonus half square triangle, make sure that that line is on the outside. I know that might seem like so you wouldn't have to say that, but you wouldn't believe how many times I caught myself doing just the opposite. All right, and we're going to sew on the line. You're going to put the 1/4 inch mark along that seam and trim the corner off. So now we have the first half of our square and a square. We're going to press that and add the other corners. Now this, you can see, is the reason why we did not just do all 4 corners at once, because there is a little tiny bit of overlap, and that's good. We want that. This is going to give us our seam allowance, make sure we keep our points. There's not a huge amount of overlap, but it's enough that we need to do this in 2 separate steps. So you know how I said to make sure that your half square triangle bonus line is going to be on the outside? This is why. Because it's very easy, for me at least, to not do that. It's the little things that always get you, isn't it? I know it is for me. Here's our square and a square, and now we're going to press and move on to the next step. So for this part, we are going to do strip units for the outside of the churn dash block. Now, this is the only part in the, well, I shouldn't say the only part in the entire quilt, because we do want all of the fussy cut owls facing the same direction. This is the only other part where I took a little bit of time to think about what direction the prints were going. And that's for this piece right here. And the reason I did that is because it's such a small part and it is such a bright color, and it didn't really take a huge amount of effort. So I just made sure that the feathers on this block here were always pointing away from the inside of the churn dash. So it was very, very easy to do. I just sewed the feathers pointing towards this blue, and then sewed the black on the or the gray on the outside. Now, when you're doing strip units like this, it's very, very easy for the strip units to kind of bow if you're sewing them all in the same direction. I think that's because of tension issues, but one way to not have to worry about that is to sew them in opposite directions. So we're going to sew the green and the blue together, starting with the, I guess you can say, the unmarked selvage side. It doesn't matter which side. And then when I sew the gray to the blue, we're going to go from the other side and sew back up. So that means the ends won't be quite as even, but that's okay. If you want to pin this, you can. Sometimes I will pin with long strips like this. Sometimes I won't. Just kind of depends on the mood I'm in that day. If you pin, that should help with bowing. Now, as I'm sewing this, I am not looking at where my needle is. I'm actually looking out here at the foot and down here. And I just let it go until I see a little bit of, like if I see the fabric start to do this, that's when I stop, line it back up, and just keep going. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew the other side on here because there are no intersecting seams, and then we'll press both at the same time. Now, what I like to do, I like to cut as little as I possibly can. So I'm going to fold this over in half like this and trim off my selvages. And then the pattern does tell you what measurement to cut your strip units to. So you just find that measurement. It doesn't really matter which one, but line up one of the lines with the seam line and cut. Okay, we are ready to sew block C together. have block C all done. All right, so that is all 3 blocks of our brand new pattern called Cosmos using Stephanie's collection Nocturne. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. There are 4 different sizes available in this quilt, and 3 of them have a border. 1 of them does not. I did not go over the border here in this tutorial because it's very, very similar to how you do binding, where you're just cutting everything out, sewing it together, and sewing it around. So if that's something you want to do, you have the instructions on how to do that. We do have kits available in the throw size. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great day and happy quilting.